Hey, this is Joel Duff. Welcome back to the Dead Sea Chronicles. We're up to part 11, the Dead Sea's Geological Challenge to Young Earth Creationism. As we near the end of our exploration of the geological wonders of the Dead Sea region, we need to reflect on the incredible story written in stone, salt, and sediment. Over the course of this series, we've explored a landscape most evidently shaped by millions of years of tectonic forces, climatic shifts, and the relentless power of wind and water. But more than just a scientific exploration, I hope you've seen that this journey has caused us to grapple with how the evidence intersects with questions of faith, particularly young earth creationism and interpretations of Earth's history. And you still might be wondering about the questions of faith issue and exactly how I'm going to deal with that. But that's part 12. For this episode, we're going to recap where we've been, and then we're going to look at the entire list of different challenges that this data presents to the young earth creationist worldview. So let's recap some of the geological features we've encountered and their conventional interpretation first. First up, if we just think about what characterizes this part of the world, it's a large transform fault. Continental plates are sliding past each other, torquing and pulling apart. There's uplift, which is raising all the land around it, except for the actual rift valley, which is falling down between that uplifted land that's pulling apart. So it's called a pull-apart basin. This has been occurring for long periods of time. The plate tectonics tells you that this has been in play, right, for millions of years in terms of the rate at which these plates are moving and the amount of time it takes for uplift, the amount of erosion that's occurred. All of those things suggest massive amounts of time. That's just the construction of the valley. But what about what fills the valley? We've talked a lot about salt. We've talked a lot about sediments, right? And we have one big thing we talked about was Lake Lasan, which is this Pleistocene, what we call the precursor to the Dead Sea. Sediments are found all over the Jordan Valley that are remnants of this massive lake that once filled the valley. I've shown this figure several times throughout the series, showing an original connection with the Mediterranean Sea that piped in salt water into a lagoon, allowing for an immense amount of evaporation and therefore salt precipitating and falling to the bottom of that lagoon, allowing massive amounts of salt to pile up. Eventually, that Mediterranean connection gets blocked, and you just have a single lake there fed by the Jordan River and a few other tributaries. And what you see today, which is essentially what's been viewed for the last 10,000 years, which is just Sea of Galilee, Dead Sea, Jordan River connecting the two. Here's a couple of images of massive layers, 100-foot thick layers of thousands of individual couplets representing probably years of deposition at the bottom of a lake, except that these aren't at the bottom of the lake today. These are hundreds and hundreds of feet above the Dead Sea. These would represent Lake Lasan's sedimentary features, right? Deposits from when the lake was much, much higher in the past. Then we've talked about the seismic history of the Dead Sea. Given these are two plates that are sliding past each other, they're not sliding on a daily basis. They're not creeping along. These are little jolts, right? Which are earthquakes. And larger jolts eventually shake the bottom of the lake and then cause the sediments at the bottom of the lake to be shifted and to get twisted, like you see in this particular image here. And so we looked at the fact that there are hundreds of seismites, right? Evidences of earthquakes in the sedimentary column that is below the Dead Sea. And you also see these in the Lake Lasan sediments, which represent the last 10,000 to 70,000 years, actually 14,000 to 70,000 years of the history of the Jordan Valley. Here are a couple other seismites indicated by the brackets here in sediments that are exposed because the Dead Sea has been falling over the last 15 years, and then channels have eroded into the prior sediments that were laid down. So these would be seismites from historically relevant earthquakes within the last 4,000 years that you're seeing here. We've also talked about Mount Sodom, right? This giant mountain of salt that is toward the south end of the Dead Sea. And this salt is, you can think of it as it has oozed up, it has erupted from well below, like 10,000 feet below the Dead Sea. There is a massive layer of salt, which comes from the Sodom Lagoon from millions of years ago, the weight of the sediments above that salt essentially pushes and squeezes that salt out. And it pushed up through the sediments and has now burst above the ground to form this enormous mountain of almost all salt. And so here's a picture from Dr. Mark Wilson inside of that mountain of salt, which is highly susceptible to erosion via, water, rainfall on it, which then runs down through the mountain and forms these immense caverns. We've also just mentioned there's the salt deposits, which are well below the Dead Sea sediments. So this whole basin is filled with, in places up to 20,000 feet, but let's say 15,000 feet for sure under a large portion of the Dead Sea basin, filled with many, 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 many layers of sediments, of salts, of gypsum, and a bunch of other evaporites. Right, all of which attest to a really long history of deposition into this valley. So just to kind of sum all that up, we have like the ancient Earth timeline, and then we'll compare that to what the young Earth timeline is for many of the same features I just mentioned, but we'll do a couple of those, right? The formation of the Dead Sea Rift, thought to be like it started about 20 million years ago. For young Earth creationists, have to be either at near the very end of the flood. You have to go back to the second, third part of this series to understand some of the reasons for this, but it couldn't have been, this valley didn't exist before the flood because, well, what's below this valley? What's below this valley are another 25,000 feet of sediments that are layered sediments of the rest of the geological column, which young Earth creationists say that all of the Paleozoic, all the Mesozoic, and this Miocene, at least most creationists do, say that the Miocene was all deposited during this giant global flood just 4,350 years ago. So you'd have to deposit all that material prior to this whole area cracking open and having this basin begin to form. So either the basin formed right at the end of the flood, last days of the flood, or after the flood. That's why the less than 45 or around 4,500 years. Lake Lasan is estimated by VARV counting, by carbon-14, by uranium-thorium dating, and just, looking at the amount of time it would take for the sediments to fill, somewhere 70,000 to 14,000 years. Well, I just say that doesn't really fit in the YAC timeline because that would have to be after the flood, well after the flood, because the Lake Lasan sediments are way up near the top of those layers of sediments. It's way above the salt and everything, right? So it has to be after the flood. And yet it has to be before Abraham and Lot, and we have historical records, biblical records, right, of the Dead Sea Basin pretty much looking as it does today, with a salt sea and a river Jordan. When the Israelites come back, when Moses leads the Israelites back to the promised land, he never crosses the Jordan, right? That's Joshua that has to bring them across, but he looks out and then they cross the Jordan River, right? And where they crossed is between the Dead Sea and the Sea of Galilee. So therefore, the basin had to be really low, right? Had to be a salt sea there. It had to look very much like it does today. Where does the Lake Lasan sediments fit in? Really hard to say in the young Earth creationist timeline. The Dead Sea sediments overall are thought to be, above the salt layer, hundreds of thousands of years. The young Earth timeline may be during the flood, except that I just said it doesn't really fit in the flood because you have to have this thing, the crack forming, the rift forms late in the flood. So how do you fill it with sediments during the flood? But that's kind of where anyone who's tried to answer the question where the sediments come from, they just fall back on that explanation. Well, it must have been during the flood. Formation of Mount Sodom. It's thought to have taken millions of years for this salt to have moved up through the 10,000 plus feet of sediments above it in order to come out on the surface. And then, of course, it's highly eroded and there are caves inside of there. And yet Mount Sodom has to have formed after the flood because it comes from layers of salt that are below layers that are thought to have been laid down after the flood, and then the salt came up through them and formed this mountain, and then the mountain is really eroded as well and has all these caves in it. So all those have to be less than 4,500 years. We talked about how there's hundreds of seismites that look like they're spread out over a couple 100,000 years. But all those seismites, all those earthquakes would have to fit within 4,500 years. There's annual sediment layers. There appears to be couplets that represent dry seasons and wet seasons. And that represents at least tens of thousands of layers. But they all have to be contained within 4,500 years in a young Earth creationist framework. There's multiple climate changes that are recorded in the Dead Sea sediments, whereas young Earth creationists only have one major climate change, right? You had the flood, then you have a ice age soon after the flood, which we're going to talk a little bit more about in this episode toward the end, which we haven't talked about yet, is that ice age. And yet another difficult challenge for young Earth creationists. How long the last glacial maximum took place? In other words, the last glaciation in the conventional timeline, there's been many glaciations. There's been many significant climate changes, but 26,000 to 19,000. And of course, for young Earth creations, I just said before, it has to occur just centuries after the flood, and it can only last for a few hundred years. We've got radiocarbon dates in sediments, except that, if we have 15,000 feet of sediments, the radiocarbon dates all go all the way up to 50,000 years by the time you've hit just a few hundred feet down. So if you hit just a few hundred feet down, you're hitting 50,000 years. And then after that, everything just looks like it's 50 to 60,000 years because you have such low amounts of carbon-14. Whereas in the young Earth creationist timeline, all 50,000 years of carbon dating has to be all in that 4,500 year span. And then you got uranium thorium dating, which can date things much older than 50,000 years. There are dates from that suggests, several million years of sedimentation in the Dead Sea Basin. And of course, in the young Earth timeline, you got to throw all those out, and you have to say those are unreliable because they can't possibly be that old. Let's just say the discrepancies between the conventional understanding of the history of the Dead Sea and a young Earth interpretation of the history of the Dead Sea are stark, right? There's many challenges that the Dead Sea evidence poses to young Earth creationist interpretation, and we'll sum those up in these general categories. We got the problem of time, right? We've looked at many different processes, right? From the slow movement of tectonic plates, as evidenced by, satellite measurements. So we know how fast those plates are moving today, and we see evidence there are ways to measure past rates of plate motion, which appear to be very similar to present rates. We've got the rise of Mount Sodom. That seems to take a long time for that salt to rise through the earth. We have satellite measurements to know that the entire mountain is still rising. We've got all that sedimentary evidence, right? The Dead Sea sediment contains hundreds of thousands of potential annual layers, tens of thousands almost certainly. The other ones you could quibble about whether they're actual annual rings or whether there could be two or three layers of sediment in a single year. But nonetheless, there's hundreds of thousands of layers, thin layers, which may or may not represent annual years. But even if they're not annual years, it represents tens of thousands of years because they're very fine laminations that look like they represent summer and winter, or in the case of this part of the world, wet season, dry season. We've got different dating methods, which I just mentioned several, right? We've got carbon dating, uranium, thorium. We've also talked about optically simulated luminescence of archaeological sites, showing that those archaeological sites are a little bit more than 4,000 years old. So all these things consistently point to an age that's far older than the young Earth timeline. And as I just mentioned before, climate fluctuations, numerous wet-dry changes, which change the lake levels, like Lake Lasan, was much, much higher, hundreds and hundreds of feet higher. that suggest a much wetter environment. And it would have to be wetter for hundreds of years, if not thousands of years, in order to raise the lake levels to the point that they were. And then you have periods of time which the lake levels were much lower. We talked about a time when the Dead Sea was potentially almost completely dried up. That would require hundreds of years. Remember, we did our calculations of how much salt is deposited over a period of time, or how long it would take to actually dry down the entire basin if you start with it completely full, which of course you're not really going to start with it completely full, but we said if you start with full, it's still going to take hundreds of years to dry it all up. And that was with the assumption that there isn't any new water coming in. I mean, even under the worst of climates, right? There's going to be some water input. You're going to have some rain. You're going to have, I mean, you got Mount Hermon, which has snow on it, right? And it's melting. So unless it was completely devoid of snow and there was no precipitation at all, even then you got a couple hundred years in order to dry it all the way down. You got to fit that somewhere into the young Earth creationist timeline. When did it completely dry out? We don't have any biblical evidence of it drying out in any time since Sodom and Gomorrah to present, which is 4,000 years to present. We've got the tectonic activity, as we mentioned before. So all of these challenges highlight a fundamental issue with young Earth interpretations. They require us to believe that either the evidence is massively misinterpreted, right? All the things we've talked about in the past 10 episodes are just massive misinterpretations, right? I'm either making up data, or we don't understand how things work, or maybe it does look like that, but maybe there's other geological phenomena and there's other problems with the dating methods that we don't know about today that will somehow come to light in the future and will explain all this data. Another possibility is that maybe God created the earth with the appearance of age. God just created the Dead Sea Valley as it is, with the salt layers in place, with all the layers there to look like it was, it had this history that we've been talking about for 10 episodes, but that history didn't actually happen. And actually, I don't know any young Earth creationists that would accept that particular model. For one thing, there are many layers, tens of thousands of feet below, right, in that Mesozoic layer that have fossils in them. And so most young Earth creationists don't want to say that God created rocks with fossils in them and that they don't actually represent formerly living things. Both of these ways of explaining things, the young Earth, everything has to be fit into 6,000 years and really 4,500 years, or the creation with appearance of age, they both present theological and philosophical problems that, in my view, are far more difficult than just accepting the scientific and biblical evidence for an old Earth. What responses have young Earth creationists have? Not necessarily to this particular video series. We're still kind of, waiting to see, what the response to this particular series of mine would be. But what has just generally been their response to the Dead Sea and its geological origins? Well, I'd say the responses are really meager. There's only a few hypotheses about how the Dead Sea could have formed in such a short time frame. Now, one thing we've already looked at Steve Austin's examination of sediment layers that contain evidence of earthquakes over the past several thousand years. So now it's time to look at Brian Thomas's article about the Dead Sea published at the Institute for Creation Research. So in this article of Brian Thomas's, Dead Sea sediment cores confirm Genesis. Doesn't that sound like it's an article that's going to respond and help us understand how the Dead Sea confirms Genesis? Thomas claims that the Dead Sea Drilling Project, and we've talked about the Dead Sea Drilling Project. We talked about how they took a boat out in the middle of the Dead Sea toward the center and basically cored down through the bottom of the lake through about 2,000 feet of sediments, right? Brought those up and then analyzed all the layers. Right? So Thomas claims that this Dead Sea Drilling Project has produced evidence that supports, quote, supports that the biblical is a trustworthy historical record. Now, what does he mean by that? Brian Thomas appears to be really convinced by the scientific evidence presented in what was part 5 of this series, that the Dead Sea dried up almost completely in the past. Right? He doesn't question the conventional interpretation of the evidence, but rather he asks the obvious question. Where does this dried up lake fit in the biblical timeline? Right? He sees the secular report, right? He sees the news headlines. Dead Sea dries up in the past, right? Evidence that the Dead Sea dried all the way down much farther than it is today. And he looks at that and he says, yeah, I understand. I understand what they're seeing. And it sure looks like, I'm convinced by the evidence that it dried up. And since it dried up, it must have dried up sometime in the last 4,500 years, because before that there was a global flood. So he has to try to figure out where to fit it into scriptures. All right, and I admit that's a question, right? That's a question that observations raise for the young Earth creationist timeline, and he's here to solve that. And not only is he going to solve it, he's going to say that this supports and confirms Genesis. So let's see what his article actually has to say. Let's hear it from Brian Thomas himself. So according to the Bible, in around 2000 BC, right, that would be 4,000 years ago, what is now the Dead Sea used to be a plain that was probably served as farmland for people of the nearby debauched city of Sodom. Genesis 14 first names the valley during the time of Abraham, then called Abram, as the Vale of Siddim, which is the Salt Sea. So apparently it was a vale or a valley and had been relabeled the Salt Sea by the time that the original writers were editing and compiling, probably by Moses some 400 years after Abraham. So here, Thomas has taken a moment to explain why in different parts of scriptures it has different names, or it's changed names over some period of time. But so what we see here is, first, I mean, Thomas has to believe that, because he must know from the article itself that the original authors talked about how incredibly dry, right, and humid this region must have been. Right, the climate of this area must have been very hot, very dry at this particular time, in order to allow for this salt lake to dry down to the point where it was almost completely dried out. Right, so obviously, this area is not going to be very conducive to agriculture, right? To city living, to having farmers, growing plants on pure salt deposits. They got salty vegetables there, adapted vegetables. So Brian Thomas continues, though. The researchers found the pebbles in the drill core beneath many storm and season deposited layers of salt and mud that may represent a time before the Salt Sea's existence. So he's saying, so there's this layer of pebbles. We talked about this earlier. There was you get all these precipitated minerals, right? Salts and gypsum and so forth, and clays and the clastics, right? And all of a sudden, way down this core, you find these much larger pebbles, indicating that where they're at in the core, in the middle of the lake, there were pebbles there. Well, how did the pebbles get there? Because the lake was so low that now the stream that comes down into the lake deposits, larger debris closer to the center of the lake, indicating that it's very, very low, right? It's almost dried up. Otherwise, right now, it's hundreds and hundreds of feet away from the shores where they drilled. And none of these pebbles would ever get out that far. We don't see them in the column otherwise. All right, so what is he going to claim here? He's going to say that this was before the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. The research demonstrates that the Dead Sea was once a dry region, supporting the Bible as a trustworthy historical record. Well, so that's his whole point, right? Oh, look, they found out that the Dead Sea had almost completely dried up. And therefore, the Dead Sea was much, much lower than it is today. This whole area was very dry and arid, which supports the Bible somehow. Except that Lot and Abram saw a well-watered place. They saw oases. They saw, vegetation. I mean, he even admits here, even Brian Thomas admits that there's cities there. He even indicates later in this article that maybe these cities are actually underneath the water, which is one thing that some biblical archaeologists have suggested, is that Sodom and Gomorrah might actually be underneath, right? So this is a time maybe when the water was much lower in the past and people built cities around that. And now the water's actually come up to the level it is today and is covering over those cities. So they're lost cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. Well, we've got to talk about this for a few minutes. For one thing, these are basically the only reports. These are the only young Earth creationist attempts to talk about anything about the Dead Sea geological record. And so that's all I've got to work with. So let's discuss Brian Thomas's ideas here. This interpretation is wrong in so many ways. So let's examine a few of them, not just to correct Thomas, but to maybe help us understand the history of the Dead Sea better. That's what I love about looking at wrong, data sometimes. It really helps you think about, like, when you understand what's wrong with it, you'll actually understand the origins of the Dead Sea. Here's the scenario that Thomas and I are dealing with, all right? There's 2,000 feet of water that need to have completely evaporated, right? That's the amount of water that's in the deepest part of the Dead Sea, right? We're going to have to assume there was no rain, no natural spring still bringing in water. Jordan River has basically been shut off, right? If all these conditions were met, then at 5 feet per year rate of water evaporation, it might be possible. I mean, when we looked at my estimate of salt accumulation, all that was that would be dreamy, all right, to have that much evaporation per year. But nonetheless, let's say it was that much possible. Well, that would still take 400 years, right, for the Dead Sea to evaporate. And in that previous episode, we talked about the fact that the lower it gets, the more dense the salt gets, the lower the evaporation is, and the more humidity there is, the deeper the basin is. There's all kinds of other variables that make it harder and harder and harder to dry things up, which makes it pretty remarkable that in the past it actually does seem to have dried up. I mean, Brian Thomas agrees with the evidence presented that yes, it was almost dry. And I agree that it looks like it was almost dry. It would have to take a really unimaginable, climate change that was very detrimental to this particular region in order to dry this lake down that far. But this fact just flies in the face of Thomas and the young Earth creationist timeline. We've already said, for him, Noah's flood occurred at 2,350 BC. That's 4,350 years ago. Abraham and Lot looks down the Dead Sea at 2,100 BC. That's 4,100 BC. And they see this well-watered valley. So in Thomas's chronology, he only got 250 years to completely evaporate the Dead Sea all the way down to approximately where we now find it after the global flood, much less getting it all the way down to near nothing, which might be a couple hundred more years. He doesn't have 400 years in order to get rid of all this water. After all this evaporation, what would have been left is just a crust of salt. Right? If it really had dried down that much, there would just be salt everywhere. I mean, there's a lot of salt around there right now, but it would have been even saltier. Why would people decide to migrate to the very lowest parts of the valley where there would be no living water, right? Why would they build cities below what is even today the Dead Sea water level? How could they have any urban area and agricultural development? How would that have taken place? I think the natural conditions for this super high rate of evaporation, which Thomas has to assume, they're just unfathomable, impossible by any known natural mechanism. The Dead Sea sediments show discrete bands deposited under changing conditions. If this thing was just dry, the environment dry constantly all the time, right, with no seasons really to it, because you're going to have to eliminate all the seasons. It's just going to have to be dry desert, no rain all the time, in which case you'd get a very consistent sediment profile. I've shown you lots of pictures. The one right behind me here shows interbedding of salt and gypsum and sands and clays and so forth, representing different inputs into the lake at different times. Different temperatures of the lake, different salinity levels of the lake, right? But we're only just scratching the surface of the problems for Thomas's Dead Sea story, right? We're going to bring in, there's the reason I waited till the very end for this particular story, because it kind of brings in all the things we've talked about. Thomas doesn't mention to his audience that below the 2,400 foot core, right, this 2,400 feet of sediment that were cored out of the bottom of the Dead Sea from the Dead Sea Drilling Project, there's another 10,000 feet of layers that include massive amounts of salt. We've talked about up to 6,000 feet of salt deposited That would be below where Brian Thomas is talking about this thing having dried up. And our last episode, we calculated how much salt would be left if you dried up an entire basin of the Dead Sea that was filled with salt water, and you'd only end up with 33 feet of salt, not 6,000 feet of salt. So where did all those sediments come from? When did they get laid down? Before the Dead Sea dried up, how did they all get laid down? When did this happen? I need to know. Has Brian Thomas considered where the 770 feet of sediment that now fits on top of the pebbles, because the pebbles are at 770 feet. I neglected to mention that before. So out of the 2,400 feet at the level of 770 feet, that is where we find the pebbles. And so if you go down 770 feet, that's all the sediment that's been added on top of that after the lake rose again. That's how many feet of sediment has been laid down since then. Right? Does he really think that Sodom and Gomorrah lie underneath hundreds of feet of sediments? Because if there's been 770 feet laid down, it is going to be hard to find Sodom and Gomorrah. Right? It's like they're buried. Right? The sediments represent thousands of thin layers of fine clays, halite, which is salt, other precipitated minerals. They don't show any signs of disruption of deposition, meaning they've just been constantly piling up. They have all the indicators of being a continuous, slow accumulation, right? From seasons and decades of time. So, and we've already seen, and this is Steve Austin's quote from his paper about the Dead Sea that we talked about much earlier in this series. He accepts that the last 4,000 years of history, all right, are just in the top 18.5 feet, right? 18.5 feet of sediments. He says that represents 4,000 years. And the reason he does is because he thinks these seismites line up with known historical earthquakes that are recorded in scriptures. Now, we could quibble about that, and I actually have had someone in the chat and in comments talk about some possible reasons why these particular seismites might not be aligned right. But I don't think they're going to be off on orders of magnitude, right? Meaning that, okay, instead of at 15 feet, the 1400 BC one, maybe it's at 800 feet. Now, it'd be more like, okay, I'm misreading a couple of these seismites, and so maybe they're all moved up one or two, or maybe you have to move them down a couple. So maybe it's the top 30 feet. And there's a couple of earthquakes that happened that weren't recorded in scriptures and other documents that we have from the Middle East region. Either way, we're not talking about a huge amount of change in this sort of like, mapping out the ages in this top sedimentary portion of the column. So here we have a bizarre disconnect. We've got Steve Austin, who is writing for the Institute for Creation Research. And he's talking about 4,000 years in the top 18 feet, 19 feet. And then we've got Brian Thomas, who a few years later comes along, and he is talking about the Dead Sea as well and the Dead Sea sediments. And he's saying that if you go down 770 feet below the Dead Sea, you'll find a period of time that's right about 4,000 years ago. Okay, 770 feet or 18.5 feet. Those are big differences, right? One of these two creationists must be absolutely wrong. All right, they cannot be both right. I think Steve Austin is very close. All right, I think his work makes sense, even if he's a little bit off. He's off by they miscounted some of these seismites. I think he's really close. Right? I think the seismite record, evidence is really strong. All right, so this begs a question in my mind. Did Brian Thomas not read Austin's paper? What did he think of that? Was this in his mind at all when he started blabbing on about, his reaction to a secular article about the Dead Sea drying up? And this dried up thing is 770 feet down. Actually, I kind of wonder, did he even look at the paper enough to realize it was 770 feet down? down below the sediments where this evidence of it being dried up was? I really suspect he didn't. I suspect he didn't look at Austin's paper at all, despite it being at the same organization. Why don't the readers who are presumably maybe editing these or like proof, texting them or whatever, why didn't somebody there realize, wow, there's a huge disconnect. You're saying the opposite thing that one of our other scientists is saying. Right? I think if he had done so, if he had thought about it, I think even Brian Thomas would have realized how ridiculous it would be for him to suggest that the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah would be buried underneath 770 feet of layered sediments. Right? I think his ideas are just a knee-jerk reaction to, knee-jerk speculation, right, on a current geological story of his time. If Brian Thomas had done any research, if he had read any original articles, if he had thought about this region at all, looked at Steve Austin's stuff, I think that he would have convinced himself that, yeah, this is like his hypothesis is ridiculous. So there are a whole bunch of archaeological sites around the rim of the Dead Sea Valley. We looked at a couple of those. Most of them are near natural springs or periodic streams. This makes more sense than being at the bottom of some depression, which would have always been very salty and saturated, prone to flooding, right? I mean, it wouldn't have stayed that deep for very long because, if the Jordan River were anything like the Jordan River, even today, that lake couldn't possibly be that low, right? So Thomas's inability to recognize this inconsistency in his own interpretation and other creationists doesn't get a whole lot better if we start considering the biblical evidence as is at his disposal, which apparently he just decided to ignore, right? Because when Abraham and Lot look into the Jordan Valley, as I've mentioned before, he sees a well-watered valley. All right, he doesn't see a barren desert. And if it's well-watered, how could Brian Thomas possibly think that the Dead Sea was dried up? If there are springs, if there's a Jordan River, then the lake could not dry up. There's no way it could dry up. There's nothing in the Bible that would give us any reason to believe that there was a time when the Dead Sea should have been smaller than it is now, much less completely dry. Right? There's no hint in scriptures that would allow you to say that the Dead Sea should be dried up, that you would predict the Dead Sea would be dried up. It just doesn't seem possible to fit it into the timeline, right? He's got more sediments below that point. He's got to dry it up, and he's got to have 770 feet of sediments placed on top of that. And where's he going to get that sediment from? Most young earth creationists, I think the response to this whole series is going to be like all those sediments, the 10,000 feet of sediments that are laying below the Dead Sea Basin, below the Jordan Valley, those were all just deposited in one big batch at the end of the flood. Right. And if that's the case, then that 770 feet is just part of a massive sedimentation of flood, like somehow the flood depositing all that. So Brian Thomas's idea that belief that 770 feet below is evidence that it dried up is completely nonsense, and it should be nonsense to all young earth creationists. All right, and just to put one final point on this, because I love this figure. This comes from a previous part of the series on the Dead Sea sediments. This is a kind of a cartoon of the Dead Sea sediments in a column below the Dead Sea, this core that was taken. Just the top 455 meters, right? Top 455 meters. And so this is going to be about 770 feet right here. So Brian Thomas says right here, there is this evidence right above a whole bunch of salt, which is nice evidence, right? If there's a lot of really pure salt right below that point, well, what would you expect if the Dead Sea were drying and drying and drying and drying and drying, getting more and more and more dense all the time, more saline, right? At some point, you're just going to have massive amounts of salt like precipitating out of that thing and piling up, on the bottom of that sea. And then all of a sudden, the salt precipitation stops because you've basically gotten all the way down. You've run out of water, right? And now you just have, like a couple little a thunderstorm that brings down some sediment, and it flows all the way down, lays the sediment down there along with all those pebbles. And then more rain falls, you get a little more precipitation, and then the lake begins to fill back up again. And what you get after that is you get a bunch of other sediments rather than precipitated minerals above that. All right, so that's the evidence that all geologists are looking at. Are like, yeah, right? The Dead Sea was extremely low at that point. That's what this profile looks like. And Brian Thomas says, yeah, I agree. And so this biblically is 4,000 years ago. But Steve Austin's over there, before saying that right up here at 20 feet, you know, uh, this is 4,000 years. That's what I'm saying about a disconnect. This is a whole lot of sediment, that has to be laid down between those two times. Okay, so one last thing here before we wrap it up. Did Brian Thomas completely forget about his own articles on the Biblical Ice Age? I think he did. Brian Thomas has written multiple articles about a biblical ice age that occurred just several hundred years after the flood. He's not the only one, obviously, but he's commented many, many times about this biblical ice age. Right? He doesn't seem to have connected those articles he wrote about an ice age with this particular article about an evaporated Dead Sea. Why is that? Creationists, including Thomas, they believe there's a single ice age. They said it occurred just a few centuries after a global flood, just 4,350 years ago. And so for that particular time, what do young Earth creationists think the world looked like in order to get this ice age going, right? They predict there was cooler temperatures, higher precipitation, and even in the Middle East, they think there was less precipitation. After all, right? They know that there's evidence that the Sahara was green at some point after the flood. So that has to be like between the flood and this ice age. And they would say like, yeah, during the ice age, everything was cooler, wetter, and that's where you get the greening of the Middle East. Well, if the entire Middle East was greener and there was a lot more precipitation, that would mean there's higher rainfall. That would mean there's cooler temperatures. That means there's less evaporation occurring and more water input in the Dead Sea Basin. How on earth are you going to dry out the Dead Sea? How does the Dead Sea dry down to nothing under those conditions? It's the opposite of what young Earth creationists would predict. They say all the geological evidence is stacked up against this young Earth model. Right? You've got Lake Lassonde sediments all over the bottom of the Jordan Valley, running up the sides of Masada. Right? And yet, all the archaeological sites sit on top of those sediments. So the lake was higher, right? The lake was much higher than it is in the present, not much lower. Young Earth creationists have no place to put this dried up Dead Sea. Finally, all the references of the Dead Sea in the Bible, from the Old Testament, from the New Testament, paint a picture of the Dead Sea that really hasn't fluctuated very much. Maybe just a couple hundred feet over thousands of years. That's supported by the secular data as well. All the sedimentary columns, the carbon-14 dating, the presence of different ancient settlements, very, very, very far below sea level. All of those things suggest that the Dead Sea itself could not have had massive fluctuations in size over the last 4,000 years. I just don't know where Thomas thinks the 770 feet of sediments could have come from when the Dead Sea's water level has been known to have been very stable for the last 4,000 years. So this is just one of many, many, many challenges that we have examined over the past 10 episodes. Over and over and over again, we have seen that either a very common sense perspective of the observations that we make of the Dead Sea region all point to it being much older than 4,000 years old, right? Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, even millions of years old. And then when we get down to more sophisticated analysis, all of those suggest that it's much older as well. Multiple different methods all point to the same kind of timeline. So they converge on the same answers, despite them having maybe different assumptions behind the dating methods. All of these things present enormous challenges to young Earth creationists who need to compress everything here, everything we've talked about, into this short time frame between the flood and 4,000 years ago. So they got 500 years to work with. And the challenge is for them to come up with some kind of cogent answer to this. To me, this is one of the most compelling evidence, physical evidences of an ancient Earth. one of the most compelling reasons to believe that this region is not the product of a global flood 4,350 years ago. This leaves me with one big challenge. It's a big challenge to myself. It's the place where we have to go next, right? And it's the final part of this series. I will have a few addendums. I'm going to answer questions. I have some other things I've kind of come across as I've been doing the series. So they'll be kind of like, hey, here's a hodgepodge of other stuff that I'll add on in another couple series. But to sort of wrap this thing up more formally, my last episode, Dead Sea Chronicles, Part 12, Salt, Seismites, and Scripture, reconciling the Dead Sea's deep history. So I'm proposing that the Dead Sea has a very deep history, a very deep and rich history. And so as we draw the series to close, there's one big challenge that many of you are waiting for me to address. Right? You're saying, Joel, you've been talking about this. I see that. Okay, you've been saying young earth creationists are wrong. They don't have answers for this. This is a big challenge. But what about you? Aren't you challenged? All right. How do you answer some of these questions? I mean, you're a Christian. You say that you believe the scriptures. And yet you probably some of you are thinking there are things in the scripture that contradict the evidence that you have been presenting. And so how do you reconcile these things? Joel, how do you reconcile this? What's your story? It's that question that I'm going to tackle in the last post of this series. That last part is potentially going to be the longest episode of the series. There's a lot I have to cover in order to present to you what I hope will be a cohesive interpretive framework for understanding the data that I've presented in the context of understanding Scripture and taking Scripture faithfully and seriously. So that's the big challenge I have for me, and I'll present it to you next week. So thanks for hanging out with me today. I'll see you then. Bye-bye. Thank you for watching this installment of the Dead Sea Chronology series. As we've explored today, the Dead Sea region provides fascinating insights into Earth's history and raises important questions about how we interpret both scientific evidence and Scripture. If you'd like to dive deeper into this topic, I invite you to visit my blog, Naturalis Historia, at thenaturalhistorian.com, where you'll find detailed articles exploring each aspect we've covered today, including full references and additional resources. Here's the schedule for upcoming episodes in this series. Each new video builds on what we've learned today, helping us better understand how geology and questions of the Earth's and our origins intersect in this remarkable region. You can learn more about my work and background at joelduff.org. If you found this content helpful, please consider subscribing and sharing with others who might be interested in exploring these important questions about science and faith. Thank you again for watching. Blessings to you and all who are around you.